all together, so I really appreciate that. And thanks for coming out to hear this talk. I was thinking about the title of this talk, Anti-intellectualism and the Decline of Civil Liberties. And it occurred to me that it kind of sounds like one of those be afraid talks, right? You should, I have something to tell you about you, be afraid. Anti-intellectualism, well, that's a bad thing. The decline of civil liberties, well, that's a bad thing. And combining the two, well, that can't be good. There must be something awful. So if it were a blog article, it would almost be like a clickbait sort of thing. And I want to emphasize at the beginning where it is kind of true. What I'm going to talk about, I guess you could say, be afraid, because there are some things to be afraid about. But I also like to emphasize, as a secular humanist, as president of the American Humanist Association, I like to remind people that the humanist worldview, at the end of the day, is very much a positive, optimistic, cautiously optimistic, but optimistic worldview, and that if you really look at the big picture, there is a lot to be very positive and optimistic about for your generation especially. It's really, and I mean the real big picture, like let's think about the human animal, okay? Homo sapiens have been around, what, a couple 100,000 years, and our primate ancestors, millions of years before that. All of those generations lived fairly similarly, hunter-gatherers, right? That was the extent of existence, hunting and gathering, until just a few thousand years ago, which is a sliver of time in human existence, a sliver of time. And then we start seeing agriculture, civilization slowly developing, technology slowly developing, until just a few hundred years ago, 400 or 500 years ago, we have the Gutenberg press. And with the Gutenberg printing press, we suddenly see an explosion of knowledge, explosion of technology. And that sounds like a long time ago, the 1400s, but it really is just a blink of an eye when you think of the totality of human existence and the advances that have been made in that time. And what's really amazing is that it is accelerating. It's been going very fast the whole time, but it's going even faster and faster and faster. Now we've got artificial intelligence and all the things that are going to come along with that. And of course, there's reason in the context of all that to be afraid, because there are some dangers that come along. Our environment is changing very quickly. The world that I live in is different than my grandparents' world. The world that my grandkids live in is going to be much different than my world. And there are things to be afraid about. But there's also just astonishing advances to be awed by as well, and to be optimistic about. Your generation and your children's generations are going to see advances that solve problems that have baffled humans and scared humans forever. And all of a sudden, many of these problems are just going to be solved. And it's really amazing. And so despite where I go today, just remember the big picture and remember to be hopeful about it. And I think take the warnings and the things that I'm going to tell you about that kind of scare me a little bit as responsibilities. That these are things that if we focus on them correctly, I think, can really bring about a better world. And we're moving into the future at light speed, but there are still different roads to take, different directions we may go. And I think some of the decisions that your generation makes are really going to determine which way those go. So with that said, let's talk about civil liberties a little bit, and hopefully not the decline of them. But if we're talking civil liberties, let me ask you something. Where the heck do civil liberties come from? Where does liberty, freedom come from? Anybody have any answer for that? Yeah.
Bill of Rights.
Okay, that's the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. That's where they. If we get even more philosophical about it, you're right. But if we get even more philosophical, what's ultimately the source of rights and liberties for humans? Anyone? I'll point, yeah.
Human individualism and
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Human individualism and just our ability to make decisions for ourselves.
I like that answer, I do. I'll tell you historically what's often been pointed to. Well, just look at the Declaration of Independence, right? We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's flowery language used by revolutionaries who are leaving divine monarchy, a monarchy claiming power by divine right. But the answer that I often get, especially when I talk to ordinary lay people who aren't philosophers, they'll say, oh, our rights come from God. Okay? But there's a problem with that thinking. First of all, and this is no offense to religion, this is not a theological debate in any way, but I think even the most religious person in the room would have to concede that we can't even prove that God exists. So philosophically, okay, because religion is a matter of faith. If you have faith in God, okay, but even those with deep faith acknowledge that if you're considering the existence of God, there is no proof. You have to have faith, and some people do and some people don't. But if that's the case, are we really going to say, since rights and liberties are very important to us in our society, are we really going to say at the end of the day that the source of them is something that cannot even be proven? That what if God doesn't exist? Does that mean rights don't exist? So there's a problem with that argument, that rights come from God. Another argument that you hear is that rights exist in nature. It's the whole kind of natural law thing, that rights are something that exist in nature and they needed to be discovered by humans, okay? That argument, I think, is maybe a little closer to accurate, but I still have some problems with it. For one thing, if they existed in nature, where the heck were they for most of human history? In fact, you could say in some societies, where the heck are they? Are people in oppressive regimes? Have they just not discovered them yet? Is it really nature that's holding back people from having rights, or is it something else? A serf in the 12th century, if they had just discovered rights somehow, would they have suddenly been free? No, they're not floating around in nature waiting to be discovered, are they? The more accurate source, I would say, is that rights were invented by humans, okay? They were invented. If you're really interested in this philosophical analysis, there's a nice little book by Alan Dershowitz, a very famous lawyer from Harvard, called Rights from Wrongs. And what it is, Dershowitz argues that rights were invented by humans, and not for any high-minded idealistic reason. We always like to get that way when we talk about rights, like we think of Jefferson and all that. That's true, but the reality is that rights were invented to protect us from wrongs, okay? Something was wrong in society, and one way of fixing it is to invent this concept called rights. Free speech is something that protects us from an oppressive, tyrannical government, okay? And if enough of us agree we don't like that oppressive, tyrannical government that's trying to throw us in jail for saying the wrong thing, well, I know, let's have this concept called free speech. And the thing is, it has to be universal, right? Because you can't have rights for some people and not for others. So this idea of universal rights, free speech, it works. Free press, the same thing. You're going to throw someone in jail for printing up something, an article that challenges the government? No, let's have this concept called free press. And it'll be universal, and it'll protect us from an oppressive regime. And if you run through the Bill of Rights and look through any of the rights that are in there, you can see that these rights were invented to protect us from a wrong. And the wrong is an oppressive, tyrannical government. The right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Oh, well, you know, we've got something going on here in our town. We've got the government coming in, storming into our houses, looking for whatever they want, and then throwing us in jail when they find something they don't like. I know. Let's have a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. And there you go. And it works. It's not perfect. You're still relying on courts and judges and all that thing, enforcing it the right way, and there's still some room for interpretation. But it's probably about the best system we've found so far, and it provides more or less universal freedom for everyone, and it really works. But the thing you need to realize about it, if rights were invented that way, they're human creation, they're not something that God handed to us that can't be taken away. They're not something that exists in nature. Once you point to them, well, there they are, we've discovered them. It's like discovering America. You can't take it away, right? There it is. Well, if they're invented by humans, they can be taken away and rights can be lost. And that's really something to be mindful of. Just because society has advanced and progressed in a certain way, that doesn't mean there's never regression, okay? There was more freedom in Germany before Hitler than after, okay? Germany was making headway. They're not exactly a democracy, but kind of a democracy, and then wham, the reversal. Rights can be lost, and your generation should be very mindful of that going forward. So, something to think about. How do you make sure that you don't lose rights? Well, there's an old saying, right? The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I'm sure you've heard that term before. A lot of people attribute the term to Samuel Johnson, but it actually was stated by some Irish guy named Curran, who I don't think ever did anything else noteworthy, but it's a great quote. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. You have to be vigilant if you want to have rights, if you want to live in a free society. You can't just sit back and let things happen. You have to kind of be on your toes and be mindful of the importance. You have to be intelligent and involved and engaged, and notice when there's a tyrant who's kind of coming up looking to take your rights away and that sort of thing. It's just the reality of life. It's the responsibility of living in a democratic society and expecting freedom. You can't just have it. You have to kind of fight for it and fight to keep it a certain way. That's the whole idea of eternal vigilance. So, with that being the case, I would ask you, if you look around in America today, does it seem like the citizenry, the population, is vigilant? Do we have vigilance going on as far as being intelligent, being informed, okay, being informed about governmental goings-on, being informed about public policy issues, being engaged in those issues and all that? Does it seem to be the case? I guess it's kind of debatable, but I think there is at least some area for concern, right? Would you agree?
Look at the voting percentage.
Yeah.
I would use that as a negative metric.
Yeah, and you would think that voting would just be kind of the minimal level of involvement, like at least get out and vote. Okay, if you're not going out to meetings and all that, at least get out and vote. And we have a relatively low turnout just for that. And also look at what you have in terms of what would I call public dialogue, let's call it that. Look at the quality of the public dialogue, right? There's just anger, right? Everyone's angry in America. Is there anyone who's not angry? You've got the white working class, you've got minorities, you've got women, you've got the Christian right, and just about anyone with skin in the game, which is everyone, seems to be angry about something at some level or another. There's just a lot of mistrust, a mistrust of government, and there's also a lack of knowledge, right? There's the population, if you want proof that the population is uninformed, I think there's one statistic out there that only about a third of Americans don't know who the vice president is. I mean, we're not talking about, the Secretary of Commerce or something rather obscure. A third of Americans don't know who the vice president is. Another third of the population, or perhaps even 40%, don't believe in evolution, okay? Evolution is not something to be believed in. It's something to be understood and accepted. It's a scientific truth. It's not something that's really debated in the scientific community at all. But we've got open rejection of science. Okay, how problematic is that when you've got a population? If I'm saying you need an intelligent, informed electorate, and you've got people who just reject science if it doesn't conform to their theological views, that can be very problematic. We've got a president who seems to reject climate change, the climate science. There's no dispute really among climate scientists about climate change. There might be very minor disagreements over certain things, but the issue is not one that's hotly debated in the scientific community. But here we are with a very large percentage of the population believing that there are two sides and that sort of thing. Why is that? What's going on? And isn't that reason for concern? Well, I would suggest that it is. It's reason for great concern. In fact, if you look at the American situation with so much disarray and so much mistrust, I think you can point to anti-intellectualism as a reason for it. You could call it something else, but I think anti-intellectualism is actually a pretty good word for it. There was a book written back in 1963 by Richard Hofstadter that is still very pertinent today, called Anti-Intellectualism in American Society. And it actually won a Pulitzer Prize that year, so it's worth checking out. But he talks about the strain of anti-intellectualism that runs through American society, just as the title suggests. About 40% of the book is devoted to fundamentalist religion, and it just goes to show how much of an influence that is on anti-intellectualism in society at large. But just the tendency for Americans not to really want to absorb a whole lot of facts and analysis, and the skepticism of Americans, of intellectuals. And I say that, I don't hold myself out as some kind of high-minded intellectual myself. I mean, but by saying you're against anti-intellectualism, that doesn't mean you're saying that everyone has to be an intellectual. Not by any stretch. You just have to be mindful of the importance of being informed to a certain level and respecting expert opinion and scientific opinion on things that are not disputed. But to be willfully blind to scientific facts that's anti-intellectual. The average working man can be against anti-intellectualism. By saying you're against anti-intellectualism, and woman too, I should say, when you're saying you're against anti-intellectualism, that doesn't mean you're saying, well, everyone has to go out and get a PhD or a college degree at all for that matter. But you have to have a certain respect for intelligence and critical thinking, independent thinking, and you have to be aware of institutions and entities and individuals out there who are trying to pull the wool over your eyes, who have an interest and are trying to bamboozle you, I guess is a good word. And there's a lot of that going on. I had mentioned the need for eternal vigilance. Well, if I'm saying that Americans by and large are not eternally vigilant, can you think of anyone or anything out there that definitely is eternally vigilant in our society when it comes to government? Any? Well, let me say, oh, yeah.
The press.
Yeah, Sometimes some press is more interested in writing about the Kardashians than they are writing about. But yeah, they tend to work. Yeah.
The Supreme Court?
They do their work. Yeah. I guess in a certain way they're pretty vigilant. If you say people are going to work and doing what they're supposed to do, not always the way we like, but yeah.
Like advocacy groups like the NRA or the ACLU.
Oh yeah, I would say that. That's true. How much power they have? Well, they do have a certain amount of power. What I was thinking of, though, was just the corporate sector as a whole. Corporations are very vigilant. Okay, I've heard the whole concept of corporate personhood. The corporations are not people. I'm sure you've seen that online. Well, actually, legally, they are people, and I'm not going to get into that debate whether they should be people or not. But I will say that if you are looking for an example of upstanding citizens in terms of being involved and engaged in making sure government listens to them and does what they want, this is what ordinary humans should be doing. Ordinary humans are not doing it, but who is? The corporate sector. I go to Washington, D.C. quite frequently, and that city is filled with lawyers, filled with lobbyists. It's hard to find people who aren't one of those two things. Okay, lawyers and lobbyists everywhere. Almost all of them work for corporations and industry. Okay, that is vigilance. When you have an army of lawyers and lobbyists who are engaged with government to try to influence public policy. In a democracy like ours, the idea is to engage in government and influence public policy. That's the whole idea of good citizenship, participatory democracy. Well, who's doing it? The corporate sector. They are out there. They've got the government's ear. They are very vigilant about getting what they want. And that might be part of the reason why government is not as responsive to us as we'd like them to be. I'm sure it's a big part of the reason. But when the when there's legislation being proposed having to do with pharmaceuticals, a pharmaceutical industry is right up there, and they may have one or two people testify on behalf of the average Joe or doctors, but the industries have the money and the wherewithal to really pursue their interests, and they do it in a very big way. So something to be to be mindful of, and keep in mind with corporations, if they are people, they consider doing a psychological profile of this person that is a corporation, okay? If a corporation is a person, you have to agree that an honest psychological profile of this person would be that this person is as narcissistic as a person could possibly get. They are absolutely obsessed with one thing, and that is their own economic interests. They promote themselves. They work 24 hours a day. They don't have any concern about families. They don't have any concern about sleeping at night or anything. They're not human. They are legal people. The word corporation comes from the same root as the word corpse. Okay, it's a body. Okay, it's an artificial body, a legal body that is literally a legal fiction, but a fictional person in the law. But that person is obsessed with its own interests and nothing else. And it has no moral compass, okay? And I'm not trying to attack corporations saying this, I'm really just stating objective facts. A corporation has no moral compass, okay? You might say it has the moral compass of its management, but not really, especially publicly traded corporations. They are under tremendous pressure for quarterly earnings to be up this quarter compared to last quarter. That's the pressure, and there's tremendous pressure. Management gets that's all they're focused on. That's why tobacco companies for many, many years fought like hell to suppress information that cigarettes are bad for public health. It's why many industries are responsible for doing things that are very contrary to public health and public welfare, because they're pursuing that profit motive, and that's just the structure of the beast. So I didn't want to turn this into a long talk about corporations, but anyway, what do we do? Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to mention as far as the topic at hand is when it comes to the idea of anti-intellectualism and all that, there's another book that's worth checking out. It's called The Moral Animal by Robert Wright. It came out in the 90s. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it talks about the influence of evolution on the human animal, especially evolutionary psychology. And it's very interesting because you would think that if there's this problem of anti-intellectualism, and I made it sound like it's unique to America, and in some ways it is. The American experience with anti-intellectualism is kind of exceptional in its own way. But what Robert Wright points out in his book is that there are tendencies and impulses that humans have that we've inherited through evolution that really make anti-intellectualism kind of the norm. We like to think that if we're just aware of it, oh, we can solve the problem. But the bad news here is that as animals, we probably are not naturally inclined to be engaged and informed and to always focus on reason and rational thinking and to not be driven by emotional impulses, okay? These are all things that we should be practicing if we are going to be good citizens. But the reality is that everyone is prone to things like confirmation bias. I have an opinion, and if I can find facts to back it up, I'll remember those facts and I'll repeat them. But if I see facts that tend to run contrary to my opinion, I might not remember those and I might not be inclined to share them and that sort of thing. So one of the big problems that we face as a society going forward is the challenge of our human nature. We should be aware that our human nature is not such that all we need to do is focus a little more and we'll have that participatory democracy that we all want so much. Our default setting probably is to not go out to that city council meeting and to not be all that involved in public policy and to rely on the opinions of others and that sort of thing. But I think if we're aware of that, we can also take steps to minimize the negative impact of it. I think it's more dangerous to pretend that we're something we're not, and that, okay, we're all psyched up now, we're all going to be good citizens, and we're all going to be it. Maybe it's important to systemically have things in place that take account for the fact that most people really aren't going to pay attention to the news as much as they should for an effective democracy. There needs to be some sort of, and I'm not standing here with the answer either, but I think we do need to be aware of that. We can't just fool ourselves by saying, oh, all we need is a little more motivation and all that. We'll have the democracy we want. We have to be aware that that's probably not the case, that the human animal does have a tendency to be lazy and maybe disinterested in policy matters. There are some people who love music or love this and love that. There are some people who just don't really care that much about public policy, and that's a reality. So what do we do systemically to account for that if we need eternal vigilance, right? We need to think about these things. And then on top of all that, there's the future. Because with the way that technology is going, whatever has worked in the past might not necessarily work in the future anyway, because technology is just changing things at such a rapid pace. They talk about this being the age of data, that more data is created in a year now than was created in centuries before. and that's really with the Internet of Things out there. If you're familiar with that, the internet basically is everywhere, and it's going to be in all devices, and things that we never thought being connected to the net are going to be connected to the net. And there's a very interesting book by an author named Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote a book called Sapiens, which is relevant to what I've been talking about today, but even more relevant, especially if you're looking at the future, is a book called Homo Deus. It talks about the next stage of human evolution, being with humans basically almost like cyborgs. Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but with advances in genetics and other advances, we're going to have artificial parts. We're going to have nanotechnology going through our blood system, detecting things all the time, detecting diseases almost before they happen. And I mean, the advances that are coming in the not too distant future are just amazing. But that's going to make for a different society, isn't it? It's going to make for a much different world, and there's going to be corporations out there that have so much information about us, and there's going to be artificial intelligence that literally knows us better than we know ourselves. Okay, they're going to know, it's going to know so much about psychology and about decision making. We tend to think that we make decisions rationally, but actually studies have shown we don't make decisions rationally. Even the most rational person tends to make a decision by impulse. There's an emotional impulse that fires in the brain before the conscious decision is made, and that emotional impulse it's very complicated and beyond my pay grade, but it's all very interesting stuff, and it's going to make for different needs politically. The system, to think that a system designed in the 18th century just needs a tweak here or there, and everything's going to be fine, roaring off into the late 21st century, is just fooling ourselves. We need to realize that there's a lot of need for consideration of what we can do to structure society, and the whole concept of society being run by algorithms, which is what a lot of artificial intelligence is really basically being run by algorithms. And there's an argument out there to say that we as humans are basically really nothing but algorithms ourselves. That free will is just an illusion, and that we are just responding to stimuli based on our biological makeup and our environmental history. And that's a discussion for another day as well, but there's certainly something to all this that we need to be thinking, if there are going to be algorithms running our society in years ahead, what do we want those algorithms to be doing with us? How do we want those to be affecting government? What does free press mean in an age where the internet and social media? I know there was a talk today, somebody was asking about whether the First Amendment applied to Twitter. Well, no, it doesn't apply to Twitter. Twitter can do whatever it wants. I guess it applies to Twitter in a certain way, that the government can't tell Twitter what customers it can have and what it can't. So Twitter has freedom, but there's a whole lot out there that's going to be done by corporations. You got Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google. These corporations are going to have, they already have tremendous power, but corporations like them are going to be even more powerful in the future. And is it their profit motive that's going to determine how much freedom you have, or can there be other rules? Can we, as citizens in a democracy, somehow ensure that our freedom is there, and that our freedom can be protected? So these are all issues that you're going to be dealing with. Your generation is going to be probably making rules for a lot of this stuff in years to come, and you should be giving it some thought already, because decisions are going to have to be made, and America could be a much different place in years to come if we're not careful. It could be, well, it's going to be a much different place. It could be a much different place in a very bad way, if we're not mindful of the need to control government and control corporations and ensure that government works for us. There's a question, really what it comes down to is whether we are going to have human-centered public policy going forward, okay? Is the law going to be focused on general prosperity and quality of life for the mass of society, or is it going to be focused on just basically the profits of a few? And it really is kind of that simple, at least at the start of the analysis. It's going to go one way or the other, and you know, it remains to be seen. There's concepts like universal basic income, whether after all, many jobs are going to be replaced in years to come. I'm sure you've heard about that, right? I'm not the first one to tell you that, but one of the things Harari talks about is that there's going to be an entire class of people that he calls the useless class. And he doesn't say that in a derogatory way, but just in a very real life, practical way. There are going to be people who are just not employable anymore because machines can do work so much better than others. You know, we talk about jobs going overseas. They're not going overseas nearly as fast as they're just being replaced by automation. And we're going to have truck drivers unemployed in a few years. Every truck driver in the country will probably be unemployed in the not too distant future because they'll be self-driving. They're a heck of a lot cheaper. You know, companies hate their personnel budget because it's usually a huge part of their budget. If they can replace personnel with machines, they will do so, and they will do so in every sector, not just, you know, retail and that sort of thing, but even professions. Even lawyers, God forbid, you know, even many medical professions. I mean, there will still be jobs, but there will be so few jobs or so many unemployed that we're really going to have to rethink as a society. Well, maybe we just need to give everyone a certain level of sustenance so that you know, we don't have starvation in the streets, because we don't want to go back to a Dickensian atmosphere, right? Or maybe some people do, but these are things that really need to be thought about, and solutions need to be developed. And I'm not standing here with the solutions, but I'm saying, you know, besides, never mind losing liberties and everything else, but liberty becomes secondary when you can't even feed your family. So anyway, on that upbeat note, be afraid. And I'd be glad to take any questions or anything like that. Thank you.
I'll just let you call on.
Yeah. Anybody? Maybe not. Yeah.
Do you see revolution in the future?
Depends what you
something
call.
you can kind of measure, the society turns on itself?
Well, I guess it's possible. I don't think violent revolution is too likely in the States, but you know, I don't pretend to have a crystal ball either. When I have tried to make predictions going forward, I've often been wrong, so I'm pretty cautious about making them. But I think there could be a revolution of some sorts going forward. I think that when we do have enough people who are just unemployed and really just angry because there are no jobs and, you know, there's no way of building a better life, you know, that American dream that seems to be getting more and more elusive. I think there was an article in the New York Times today saying, you want the American dream? Go to China. That a 20-year-old person in China has a better chance of having a prosperous future than a 20-year-old person in America. That's kind of scary. But I think there will be some level of disruption. Whether it rises to the level of revolution, I guess, remains to be seen. Yeah.
But at this point in time, our unemployment is at a record low, or records low, so where's it go?
Yeah.
Do you see this as some sort of gradual increase in unemployment as AI comes in and starts taking over? You know, Uber took over the taxi cabs, and now the artificial driving is going to take over Uber.
Yeah. Well, that's what they say, that it is going to be not so slow process, but there is going to be a process in that direction. The numbers now are a little tricky too. First of all, the number of good jobs is much lower. You know, they used to be that, you know, without a college degree, you could get a job with, you know, a GM or some union and you know, get a really good paying job where you could raise a family. Now you got, you know, a 2-income family still struggling with, you know, a job, you know, as a barista at Starbucks instead of, you know, working for GM or whatever. So the quality of the jobs is going down, but also people are even leaving the employment pool, so that there's some question of whether the numbers on unemployment are really as low as they seem, because when people drop out of the employment pool altogether and basically give up, they're not included in the unemployment figures anymore either, so there's that. Yep.
Okay, all right. Yeah, your title mentioned the decline of civil liberties, but I don't know, you demonstrated that they are in decline. And frankly, my concern is more the abuse of civil liberties. And yes, you talked about rights, but maybe I'm old-fashioned, but when I was brought up, I was taught with rights go responsibilities. So with the right of free speech goes the responsibility not to intentionally, wantonly lie, to not intentionally, wantonly slander people, and, you know, invent stories about sex rings and pizza parlors, and traffic that as free speech. And we now have people that are out and out neo-Nazis holding rallies to try to gain power and turn the United States into a neo-Nazi dictatorship, and these are called free speech rallies. Now, that is why I'm concerned, not about the decline of civil liberties, but the abuse of civil liberties and totalitarian power grabs being made in the name of free speech.
Well, I agree that the idea of power grabs is out there and that it is a danger. I don't know if it's really being done in the name of free speech. I think certainly Nazis claim free speech rights for themselves, certainly. But I think what you're saying is that should they actually come to power, that's the danger. I don't think they're having a right to free speech, that silencing them is the answer. I think I tend to be more of an absolutist when it comes to free speech, that we can't say free speech for some and not for others. But nobody has a right to slander, you know, and that slander is outside the scope of free speech. So if there's slander going on, what you're really saying is that there are some very sketchy tactics being used by some very sketchy politicians, and I think I'd agree with that. But to call it, to define the problem in the framework of there being too much free speech, I don't really agree with that. Just as an example of, you know, civil liberties, and I meant to bring up this example during the talk and I just skipped over it, but an example of how anti-intellectualism is kind of quashing free speech today. One of the things we do at the American Humanist Association is we defend students who are trying to opt out of the Pledge of Allegiance in their school. And in America, that's an absolute right. There's a case, a Supreme Court case from 1943 called the Barnett case that says kids have an absolute right to opt out of the Pledge of Allegiance exercise if they so want to. You would be surprised how many contacts we get from students all over the country who are being berated in their schools by teachers and administrators, not by other students, but by teachers and administrators for exercising their right to opt out of the Pledge of Allegiance. And we usually remedy the problem very quickly because the law is so clear. Once they see lawyers stepping in, they back off. but it's really very indicative of the level of anti-intellectualism in this country. There are layers and layers of anti-intellectualism in the scenario that I just put out for you. First of all, there's the whole idea of our society having children every single day recite what is really a loyalty oath. That's what, I mean, it's a pledge of allegiance. That is literally a loyalty oath, okay? We're having our children do this to the flag every day. That is about as nationalistic as you can get. We are the only developed country that has our children do that. We all take it for granted because we grew up with it. I grew up with it. But it's very weird, okay, to be having our kids conduct this exercise every single day. We all love our country. We don't have to take a loyalty oath every day, but that's very anti-intellectual. Then on top of that, a kid decides to exercise his right to opt out or her right to opt out, and he gets berated for it, okay? And not by just some other student who doesn't know better, who maybe has a parent in the army, is upset, but by an educator. An educator is berating a student for opting out. It's really a very good example, I think, of just how fast and loose we're willing to play. And is there anything more cherished than free speech, right? I mean, if I asked people to name me an important right in America, I think 9 out of 10, the first thing they say, free speech. Well, here's an example of free speech being seen as, insignificant by educators, okay? And, nationalism, hyper-patriotism ruling the day. So, I think it's kind of self-evident how civil liberties are at risk when you have an anti-intellectual culture, and that really is what we have here. Yeah.
I wonder if you would say that there can be like anti-intellectualism that's disguised as calling out anti-intellectualism. So like the example I would think of is you brought up climate change, and like, well, lots of scientists, the vast majority of scientists would agree that climate change is happening. Maybe even a lot of them would say that it's from humans. There's not that kind of consensus around like what we do about that. And so like those are two different questions of if it's happening and what we do about it. But like it's really easy for people to say, well, you're a denier of science, you don't believe in climate change, if you just have like different strategies of solving climate change or different views on how bad the effects will be. So I wonder if like you'd say that that's its own form of anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, well, I think there's always room for, shall we say, sloppiness in our thinking, and I don't know if I'd always call that anti-intellectualism, but I know, because when you say anti-intellectualism is a problem, then every argument you make can be dissected to find something that's slightly illogical, and aha, anti-intellectualism on your side. And I don't think we need to be, policing ourselves at that level. Of course, we should be, on the lookout for logical flaws and things. But when it comes to climate change, there's not just consensus that there is climate change happening, but there really is scientific consensus that it's that is caused by human activity. Now, you're absolutely right, though. Having reached that point, this is where we should be having the debate, what to do about it. And there might be a lot of very legitimate, different, conflicting arguments about what to do about it. There are some people who think nuclear power is a very important element in solving the problem, and they have some very good arguments. There are other people who say, oh no, we can't go there with nuclear power because there are problems with that, and we need to look more at renewables and things like that. And the question is, like, can we do enough with just renewables, or and these are the debates we really should be having as a society. And there might be good arguments, there might be some arguments that have a lot of flaws in them, and you can call those anti-intellectual, but I think there's a difference when you're talking about legitimate arguments and some being stronger than others and some having flaws. I don't know that that's necessarily anti-intellectualism. I'm not going to call every weak argument anti-intellectual. I think it's more of a cultural thing when you have cultural phenomena that, you know, where if we ask the general public, who's Kim Kardashian, and 99% no, and we say, who's Mike Pompeo, and, you know, 30% no, that's evidence of, okay, there's something going on in this culture that's somewhat anti-intellectual.
To follow up on that question, that was interesting. So the majority of people who believe in man-made climate change would probably be sympathetic to the Paris Protocol that we withdrew from. But if you ask probably 90% of those people, they really probably couldn't describe the Paris Protocol.
Right. Yeah.
Anti-intellectualism?
You know,
I mean, it's kind of running with the crowd and...
Yeah. I think that's a very good question, and I'm not going to stand here and say, well, like, I'm the authority to say, yes, anti-intellectualism, yes, anti-intellectualism, no. I think it's something that, you know, we as a society need to think about and talk about. Should every person really know a whole lot about the Paris Protocol? I think the reality is that if the Paris Protocol is actually on the table as an agenda item in the near term for our society, which it is not, but if it were, then we kind of have a responsibility as citizens, not to know it paragraph by paragraph, but to know the basic elements of it. But I think when an issue has been removed from public discourse because we've moved away from it because our administration has decided to, then, you know, there's not so much a responsibility now to know the elements of the Paris Protocol because it's really not a front burner issue in our society today. Should it come back to the table, you know, if we have a new administration that wants to entertain it and there's a debate about whether to rejoin it or to join it, then we could, you know, then I think the responsibility comes then. And then the question becomes, well, how many people really need to know? And what if not many people do? At what level should the decision be made? And these are questions I think we really need to consider in the future. When we've got algorithms shaping our public policy, at what point do we really look for the general population's opinion on something, and when do we narrow it down to just experts deciding? If the experts are going to decide, then what's the criteria for their decision? Is it corporate profits, or is it what's best for human, you know? And these are really decisions that have not been made yet, but they need to be made in the future. To the extent decisions like that are being made today, though, I would argue that more often than not, the decision is made based on what's best for corporate profit, not necessarily what's best for the human population. Yep.
In this transition that you're speaking of, going into the future, whereby employment would be very limited, I think we could take a note from the past as we transitioned from an agricultural society to an industrial society and saw the number of farmers reduced, so that at one time in our country, 80% of the people were farmers. It's down to 2% today.
That's a very good point, and that's actually something that both Harari and there's another author named Jamie Suskind in a book called Future Politics, talks about a lot of this algorithm stuff, that they talk about it, and it is an analogy to be drawn, but it's an analogy that only goes so far, because what happened with industrialization is that there was move from an agrarian society to an industrial society, but an industrial society that needed human labor. The economy of the future, the point of it is, it really does not need human labor. That's the reality of it. I'm not saying it doesn't need any, but there are not replacement jobs for you know, the industrial workers who are going to lose their jobs, or even other workers. Service workers are going to lose their jobs. We're going to go to restaurants and we're not going to be interacting with wait staff anymore. And you know, even the cooking is going to, just the reach of artificial intelligence and automation is probably beyond our imaginations. And so it's not a matter of just finding new jobs for people. It's maybe a matter of moving down to a 20-hour work week, so everyone has, you know, everyone works a little. Maybe a question of universal basic income, so that everyone has a certain floor of income. Lots of possibilities, but these are the more likely scenarios than just finding replacement jobs. Yep.
As far as the universal basic income, who's gonna help subsidize that? Is that gonna be large corporations who are gonna be handing out money to people?
Yeah.
Personally, I don't believe that any corporation will only give some
Yeah.
regular price.
Yeah, there's a lot of different models for it, but the bottom line is that that corporations would generally have to subsidize it, and the wealthiest, because there's going to be a kind of a cartel that you know, that really is reaping enormous windfall from all the money being made, and you know, some sort of tax that way. The one candidate that's talking about it the most is a guy named Andrew Yang. He's a Democratic candidate for president, actually, and he's talking about this universal basic income quite a bit. So we actually have, and I don't know that it's the solution for this next election cycle or if it's down the road, but you know, there is quite a bit of thinking that at some point it's going to be a necessity if we're not going to have just widespread poverty. Yeah. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I was gonna say, how can we as a population enforce that if these people who control most of the wealth, control most of the group, are in power and pretty much dictate all these decisions?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer to you, but that's one of the challenges I think we face, and it really is. Yeah, you, Minion.
I said the future's already here. Alaska has a
Yes.
program, limited as such, but
Yeah,
it's
annual.
it's
Yeah.
working.
Yeah.
I don't understand economics. I understand Apple can make all those phones with artificial intelligence, but if they don't have any workers, who's gonna buy them?
I'm sorry, I didn't really hear that comment. Can someone?
If you don't have an employed populace, where does the money come from to buy all the products that are being artificially produced?
Right. Well, it's, yeah, that's, I mean, part of it would be through UBI. It's like Henry Ford paying his employees more so they could afford his cars. So, are we out of time? Was it, I didn't know if we're going to 5:30 or.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Thank you.